Ghanaian writer Ayi Kwe Amar. A number of people are examining what Amar has had to say in his writings, and I think that if you have a chance to look at some of his books, you really will be rewarded by reading them. There's health when everything that should work together works together. Take the single person. If body and soul are working together, the mind thinks, I should do this. The will decides, I will do it. The muscle tenses itself to help the will, and the hand does what the mind has thought. Everything works together. But say there is a broken bone in the body. The mind may think something, the will may desire it, but when the muscle tries to move the hand, there are two pieces of the broken bone pushing against each other instead of working together. That is disease. The cure of that kind of disease is one of the first steps in healing. There's disease which comes from conflict between the body and the soul in the same individual. That is more serious. It takes longer to cure, years usually. There are worse diseases needing healing. When one person in a community body and soul clashes with another individual in the same community, that too is disease. The ending of all unnatural rifts is healing work. When different groups within that should be a natural community clash against each other, that also is disease. That is why healers say that our people, the way we are now divided into petty nations, are suffering from a terrible disease. The events that have shattered our people were not simply painful events, they were disasters. They were strange, unnatural catastrophes. Those who survived them could only survive in part because they found ways to forget the catastrophes. When you're still close to a past dangers that threaten to wipe you out, even remembrance pains you. Our people forgot a lot of things in order to survive. We even went beyond forgetfulness, to forget thoroughly the shattering and dispersal of a people that was once whole. We have gone so far as to pretend we have always been these silly little fragments, each calling itself a nation. We're going to explore each aspect of health in the 2 days that we will be here. We will see how all of the cells form a connected whole, the mind, the body, and the spirit, not only of the individual, but of our community as well. We will start today with Dr. Charles Finch, who has visited us many times before. He is assistant professor at the Morehouse School of Medicine. He is professor of community medicine and family practice. He has worked as an epidemiologist for Centers for Disease Control and was formerly a clinical preceptor at Duke Watts Family Medicine Clinic in Durham, North Carolina. He's a prolific writer, doing much research in terms of issues confronting African people. You can get a collection of his previously published essays, The African Background to Medical Science, which was issued by Carnac House of London in the fall of 1990. His latest work is The Echoes of the Old Dark Land, Themes from the African Eden, and he probably will tell you about some of his latest work. We invited him here because we wanted to get this tradition of medicine and healing that has come down through the ages from Africa, that's spread throughout all of the world, that is the basis of the medicine that we know today. As distorted as the Western concept of medicine is today, it had its beginning in Africa. This is what Dr. Finch will explore for us today. And inasmuch he is one of the healers that Amar referred to, trying to make the mind and body whole. Dr. Finch.
Thank you very much. It is always a signal privilege to be back in the Dallas African community, to share with you, partake with you, and be a part of your deliberations. People often ask me, how long have you been doing this? First of all, they ask you, why are you doing this? How did you happen to be doing this historical mission you have, and then how long have you been doing this? And my answer is usually about 23 years, 23 continuous years. As I like to say, that my true education didn't begin until after I left college, because the only thing that a university degree at any level of D's, as they might say, PhD or any other kind, MD or any other kind of D, is to give you the tools to educate yourself, because the only true education is indeed self-education. And what I have found, and there's a lot of ways of getting to the particular point that I have gotten to at this particular time, and as I like to tell people, I said nobody could plan to have the career that I have. Even I didn't plan it. You might have said it became, it evolved, it unfolded. I took the historical route to get to where I am today, so I'm always informed, if you might say. All my thinking is informed by an historical consciousness, because I've always needed the context in which things came to be. Because only by examining that context in time and in space, is it possible for me to get a handle on where we might go, or what the future might hold. But increasingly in recent years, I have found myself more and more deeply involved in the healing work, because a good part of my work in recent years has taken me into West Africa, particularly in the country of Senegal, where I have been involved in the work and working with two different groups, although related. Perhaps saying different is a little misleading. Two different ethnic groups of traditional healers. I would say, yes, it has been a life-changing, transformational experience. There's no question about that. Affecting profoundly the way I think and believe and act, and also affecting profoundly what I think are the solutions to the particular situation we find ourselves in today. I've even come to believe, you might say, that the future is in the hands of the healers, or at least it is the healers that will provide the keys to resolve the dilemmas we face today. Now, I've even had to evolve a kind of perspective on healing that is a little bit more encompassing than purely the biophysical or biomedical view of it. Because being a physician trained in the modern biomedical paradigm, I have come to see that there is a difference between curing and healing. Curing is a relief of physical distress, by my definition. I'm not saying it's a valid definition for all times and all places, but it's the one that I use and it works for me. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the importance and the value of the relief of physical distress. And indeed, it is often the case that the relief of physical distress can and does create such a sense of well-being that you might say it leads, in effect, to healing. But healing, if you will, is a byproduct of the curing effort. Because healing itself encompasses curing, but is something much greater than it. Because healing is simply this, or health is simply this. If I can reduce it to something, it is just the balance of forces. If, as I have had to do in recent years, begun to read more and more the popular literature in physics and quantum mechanics, you begin to realize that everything that exists in this in this universe is really just a different order of forces. Even human beings, this leaf, this watch, in some sense, really represents a congealing of forces, and that the interplay of things that exist in this universe are the interplay of forces. Then health, to me, is simply the balanced, harmonious interplay of forces. And once you have that balance and maintain it, you have health. Once there is an imbalance that is created, then you have, by definition, ill health. In fact, this is very fundamental, shall we say, to the ancient and, yes, current, contemporary, traditional African concept of disease and health. You might even say we invoked already Ma'at. What is Ma'at? If I, again, can reduce it down to its essentials, it is balance and harmony, fundamentally. And so that the ancient African concept of that which is good did not have the sort of Judeo-Christian biblical moral cast to it. Simply put, that which was good is that which was balanced and harmonious. That which was evil was simply that which was out of balance and unharmonious. So it creates a whole different perspective on what are the processes that keep us in a state of what I call balanced homeostasis, indeed keeps us in a state of harmony, because that is all harmony is a balance of the forces that surround us. So again, we find our ancient ancestors were almost obsessional about creating a totally harmonious environment. That is, not only for the individual, but for the family, for the community, for the nation, for nature, and for cosmos itself. You did not disturb nature or anything in it. You did not disturb the cosmos. You did not disturb anything around in your environment, because even the least little disturbance in itself potentially could cause dis-ease, could upset the balance, could upset the harmony in such a way to create disease that could, in fact, destroy the society itself. So disease is not just a physical manifestation of disorder. Disease, if you will, operates on many planes, and health and healing, therefore, operate on many planes. And it is indeed these balance of forces that, in my view, if you define health or healing. And therefore, if you understand that, then many of the things that happen in traditional medicine then and now become more and more understandable, become more and more easy to grasp, or at least they are more accessible to grasp by our understanding. Now, what we're going to do today, after that preamble, is again take a historical odyssey through the history of healing in Africa. Now, in a sense, it's hard to know where to begin. And while this may seem a little bit bizarre, one could easily begin at any arbitrary point. One could begin about 12 billion years ago when the universe began. One could begin a mere 5 billion years ago when the sun emerged. One could begin 4 billion years ago when the earth appeared. One could begin 2 billion years ago when life appeared on this planet. One could begin, about 80 million years ago when mammals first emerged in the process of life's unfolding. 4 million years ago, or 4.4 million years ago, when the pre-human ancestors first appeared on the African continent, or 200 to 300,000 years ago when modern human beings, again, first appeared on the planet on the African continent. One could begin, any time since then, because one thing it is important to kind of grasp or understand to put everything in context, if in fact, and this is where the overwhelming weight of the evidence points, that modern human beings appeared on the planet somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago in Africa, and if subsequently the evolution or the progress of humanity from that time forward occurred on Africa exclusively, particularly the cultural progress, if you will, the cultural evolution of humanity occurred on Africa soil exclusively, at least until about a mere 95,000 years ago, then you will begin to be able to see that which we call human culture, just like humanity itself, it arose and was born on the African continent in an African context. And so everything that culture is and everything that culture produces, whether it be symbols, whether it be mythology, philosophy, and yes, science and religion and science and technology, indeed can be found to have occurred first, and there can find its root on African soil. It only again makes sense. If human beings have been on African soil for 250,000 years or more, you might say, therefore, they had the necessary length of time to engage in those, shall we say, interactions with nature and their environment that would lead progressively by degrees to ever more advanced levels of culture, culminating, as it did, in what we call high culture or civilization. In fact, that would therefore be a logical consequence of that particular understanding. And indeed, this is in fact what we do in fact find, so that in some sense, no matter where you are on the globe, no matter what your national or ethnic affiliation might be, ultimately all roads do lead to Africa. This is not because I want it to be so. This is the way God and nature intended. So again, we do not have to derive any particular unusual satisfaction about it. We don't have to be ashamed of it. We don't have to be satisfied. It is, and it is a fact, and we can move on from that. And yet it is important that that understanding undergird everything that we perceive about ourselves and about the world, without deriving any more significance from that, and yet understanding it as an essential truth. Now, let's put the whole question of the history of medicine and healing in a wider context. And in even that wider context that we're going to put it in is, we've already tried to do that already, is somewhat arbitrarily narrowed because of the time constraints that we have. For in some sense, at least today, although I think we're beginning to change that attitude, what we think of as science, what we think of as medicine is a branch of science and technology. Well, that is itself a problematic definition, but we'll put that off for just a minute. But let's look at the whole concept or the whole question of what science and technology is or means. Because, again, where do you see its first emergence first? You find it, just as you might expect it, on the African continent. Therefore, we find 43,000 years ago, the first iron mine ever excavated anywhere on the globe. 35,000 years before there were any mines anywhere else in the world. Not just pits being dug out, but I mean systematically constructed mines in Swaziland 43,000 years ago, in which iron ore was extracted and used, most people think, or at least most people who have investigated this, to think to use as a cosmetic dye. But again, it was an iron ore. 28,000 years ago merely, what do we find? Manganese ore also being excavated as in a mine shaft 28,000 years ago in southern Africa. So here we have the beginnings of what we might call proto-technology. Its first evidence appearing, as we might expect, on the African continent more than 30 millennia ago. Now, in order to move forward from this, let us turn on the slides, because this is going to be a slide presentation. Because, let's see, you can push it forward. Yes. I'm going to have to dim the lights because of the contrast there. This light up here, too. We may even have to dim this one, too, at least this one here. I'd almost rather leave that one on and turn this one off. Okay. Let's in some ways come forward in time, because we have to do what I'm getting ready to do, again, in order to establish the proper context of our overall discussion. The other thing you may want to do is that overhead transparency projector. You may want to put that on the floor. The culmination of that cultural evolution that led over periods of tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years, to the development of high cultural civilization seems to have occurred in the lower Nile basin, in the Nile Valley cultures of what we call Egypt and Nubia, or Egypt and Kush. As most of you here know, properly speaking, Egypt was known as Kemet, the land of the blacks, and was related to Kush, which was to the south of it. Now, I have a better way of understanding exactly what this process was like, to consider this area of what we today call Egypt and the northern Sudan as one great cultural and geographic complex, which is to say the lands we call Egypt and Kush, or Egypt and Nubia, i.e. Kemet and Kush, together constituted one great cultural complex. So much so that in many cases it is more illustrative to think of this as a Nile Valley cultural complex. Now, the one thing I don't think it's necessary to say here, but I will say it anyway, Egypt is not now, nor has it ever been, in the Middle East. As it has been for about 4 billion years, is on the African continent. But the Egypt that I'm talking about, the Kemet that I'm talking about, the Kemet of the pyramid builders, was in every essential respect not just geographically African, but ethnically, culturally, and racially African in every sense of the word. In fact, the whole term, this is the way in which language and terminology is often used, shall we say, to confuse our perceptions. The reason why I say this is because the very term Middle East is an artificial, arbitrary pseudo-term. Why do I say that? Because geologically and geographically, the Middle East is really Africa's northeast extension. In other words, if you are a geologist and you dig down about 10 feet, 100 feet, or 500 feet, or 1,000 feet, geologically there's absolutely no difference from Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, Palestine, Sinai, than from Africa. And if you understand plate tectonics, that is, the movements of continents, you understand why this happened. It used to be that what we think of Saudi Arabia, Sinai, and were all joined together from Africa, but began to move apart inch by inch over periods of millions of years, eventually creating the basin which we call, now it got filled in with water from the Mediterranean, called the Red Sea. But in fundamentally speaking, it is more appropriate, more accurate, and makes more sense to call that area Africa's northeast extension. Middle East doesn't make any sense except if you are trying to do what has attempted to be done, essentially detach not only that area, but all of North Africa from Africa. Now, again, this is, so the whole idea of the Middle East itself doesn't make any sense, and it really is a complete artificial construction that has actually absolutely nothing to do with either the geological, the geographical, or even the historical reality. We're going to come back to this area because it is important when we discuss the history and the evolution development of the healing science and the healing art in Africa. Next slide, please. Or I think I can control it here. Now, you look at this monument and it's obvious what it is, even with its nose blown off. The Sphinx, which is the largest, most prominent, most famous, best known monument in the entire world. Even with his nose blown off, it is clear that whoever was the model for this fantastic piece of sculpture was an African by origin. Now, the reason why I'm getting ready to show you this, again, is to begin to show you ways in which our concepts of historical time are beginning to change considerably. Due to different kinds of works that are being done around the Sphinx, and therefore our concept of Nile Valley time, Nile Valley historical time again, is being changed radically due to recent work. Now, this is an article. The Sphinx may be older than it looks. Now, what is this in reference to? It's in reference to the work of a man named John Anthony West and a geologist, a geophysicist named Robert Schoch from the University of Boston University. Now, it is possible to see, even though it may be not easy to see very sharply, the surrounding quarry in which the walls of the quarry in which the Sphinx sits, you can see how these vertical grooves. Those vertical grooves, by the way, also exist on the body of the Sphinx itself. Those vertical grooves are unanimously said by geologists to have been created by water erosion. That is, the water rushing down those walls in sufficient quantity to have caused these erosive fissures as you see there. Now, why is this important? And by the way, I think there's a better shot of it there. Yeah, it's even more dramatic there, as you can see. Now, why is that important? It's important for the reason that the last time there was rainfall in Egypt or Kemet, that region of northeast Africa, sufficient and frequent enough to have caused such erosive fissuring of this magnitude was between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. Now, what does this mean? Well, ordinarily, the dating of the Sphinx is 2500 BC. Now, if the Sphinx's body and the quarry surrounding the Sphinx are shown to have this kind of fissuring, and if this fissuring is due to rainwater, and if significant rain falling on that area last occurred somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, then the quarry and the Sphinx in which it sits must also be of that age. Well, what does that do? Well, that about doubles and maybe even triples the age of the Sphinx, and since it is an architectural and artistic marvel, it also means that the Sphinx, that the culture, there was a culture in place right there with sufficient development, sufficient technical expertise, sufficient artistic ability to have created such a architectural and engineering marvel, and that means it may double or triple the age of Nile Valley civilization, or suggest that prior to the dynastic civilization there was another advanced civilization in place. Either way, it begins to radically alter our perceptions of the timeline of civilization, particularly in the Nile Valley. And when you think, when you connect it up with other fragments, and they are only fragments of evidence, we're beginning to see that the standard, conventional chronology of civilization in the Nile Valley is, again, an artificiality. Napoleon used to say that history is a set of lies mutually agreed upon. Well, that is certainly the case where Nile Valley history is concerned. Egyptologists as a group, not all of them, but as a group, have settled on a particular date or set of dates, a range of dates within a narrow range, and have agreed that come what come may, at all costs, they will defend these dates even when they do not hold up against other evidence brought that suggests a much higher chronology. Now, this is one sort of indirect evidence of this higher chronology. Some of you may have seen this in Ivan Van Sertima's Blacks in Science. Actually, this is a bone. It's only one bone, but it's pictured from two different perspectives, front and back. On the right, you see the diagrammatic representation of this bone shown with horizontal markings grouped in this fashion. Now, this bone was discovered in a group of artifacts that were found in northeastern Zaire along what was then called Lake Albert, that is, the Great Lakes regions of East Central Africa. And this bone was found among a group of hundreds and hundreds of harpoon points and other artifacts. We'll come back to that in a minute. But what de Heinzelen, he was the Belgian anthropologist, archaeologist who was the first one to excavate and analyze these finds, said, well, the first thing that strikes you is that these groups of markings represent numbers or number system. He said, now, not only is it merely a number system, but it's a number system, according to him, that suggests a familiarity with the decimal system. Not only does it suggest a familiarity with the decimal system, it suggests a familiarity with prime numbers. Now, his original dating for this find was 8,500 years ago, 6,500 BC. Well, that's okay, but it's not really all that revolutionary because there are other finds in other parts of the world that are older. Well, that was okay until very recently when a team of scientists from George Washington University redated the whole group of artifacts based on much more sensitive instrumentation. And they got a date of not 8,500 years, but 25,000 years. So 25,000 years ago, what do we have? We have the evidence of proto-mathematics in Africa. At the place, culturally, anthropologically and culturally, where African culture and indeed human culture begins. Now, let's go back to the harpoons, because those harpoons are very important. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting her name. Allison Brooks is her name. She and her husband, Brooks and Yellen. The harpoons are stone harpoon points used to fish for and kill aquatic animals, even animals as large and dangerous as hippopotami, in the lakes of East Central Africa. What is interesting about those harpoons is that the oldest harpoons date from between 25,000 and 70,000 years in East Africa, and you don't find any harpoons of that quality anywhere else in the world of that age. Now, what is also interesting is Heinzelen says you can follow this harpoon northward down the Nile all the way not only into Khartoum, which is the Sudan, and into what we call Egypt, but even into Palestine. The harpoons, if you will, point the direction of the cultural movement of peoples out of Africa's Great Lakes region. So, what are we therefore to conclude? Well, not only did the harpoons and the culture that are associated with them descend the Nile, but so did the proto-mathematics. Which now brings us to this. The title page of the Rind Mathematical Papyrus. The Rind Mathematical Papyrus is dated about 4,000 years ago, but it's older, or at least the mathematics within them is older. The first textbook of mathematics in the history of the world, or the oldest one that we have ever found. This is the title page from the Rind Mathematical Papyrus in Northeast Africa. And it says, translated, investigation into the knowledge of all mysteries and all secret things. Now, what does the Rind Mathematical Papyrus give you? There are four basic forms of mathematics that you can find in the Rind Mathematical Papyrus: arithmetic and number theory, elementary algebra, and this is problem number 24, which seeks to find the solution to this problem by means of an unknown through something called the false position. Now, anytime you have an equation that solves a problem by means of an unknown, you have, by definition, algebra. And here it is. 4,000 years ago in Northeast Africa. They also had elementary geometry. As you see here, this problem gives you the area of a triangle, 1/2 the base times height. Other problems in the mathematical papyri of the Egyptians, there are 4 that have survived. This is the most important one, but there are 3 others. Give accurate formulas and solutions for calculating the area of a rectangle, area of a hemisphere, volume of a truncated pyramid, area of a triangle, area of a circle, and all showing a mature discipline. The Egyptian mathematicians demonstrated a thorough knowledge of basic algebra, as I have already indicated, proving able to solve equations of the first and second degree. That is, algebraic equations with 2 unknowns involving a square. This problem, which is problem number 56, however, represents a different order of mathematics yet. This is still in the Rin mathematical papyrus. Seeks to find the slope of a pyramid whose height is 250 cubits and whose base is 360 cubits. The answer, 5 and 1/25 palms for each cubit in height represents the cotangent of the angle of the slope of the pyramid's face. Now, if you can find a cotangent, all you have to do is turn it around, reverse it, and you get the tangent. So you got a tangent already. Also, it is possible if you can kind of project your mind, even though they're showing you the pyramid, of course, is a 3-dimensional structure. It is very easily possible, and we almost have to assume that it did happen, to inscribe a triangle within that 3-dimensional structure. When you can do that, when you can inscribe a triangle within that 3-dimensional structure, you can also have the means of finding sine and cosine. Tangents, cotangents, sine and cotangent, sine, cosine, tangent, and cotangent. What does that mean? Trigonometry. That's what that means. And the history of science, history of mathematics says that, or has said that Hipparchus, merely 180 years before Christ, was the one who had invented trigonometry. And here it is sitting in the Rin mathematical papyrus out of Northeast Africa some 1800 years before that. You can draw your own conclusions as to the validity of Hipparchus's discovery. This is a scale drawing of the curve whose particulars are indicated in ancient diagrams shown below. The architect's diagram defining a curve by its coordinates. The x-axis, you've done this in high school, first year algebra, second year algebra, even geometry. X-axis, y-axis, finding a point in 2-dimensional space. Well, here it's coordinate geometry. And here you have it in the Old Kingdom as indicated here in an Egyptian drawing. So here they had made first steps into what we might call coordinate geometry. So we're not just talking about rudimentary playing with numbers. We're talking about a systematic mathematics that had gone from the relatively elementary, if you will, to the more increasingly complex, up to and including geometry, trigonometry, and coordinate geometry. And we can find that it has a direct line, a direct lineage, if you will, to the Ishango bone. Because the technique of, first of all, the marks on the Ishango bone are exactly the same marks used to indicate the number 1. The same strokes used to indicate the strokes in Egyptian mathematics. Also in the Ishango bone is the decimal system, which was which was basis of Egyptian mathematics. Also, we don't have time to discuss this, is the method of multiplying by doubling, which is also in the Rin mathematical papyrus. So you can almost trace a pedigree from the Rin mathematical papyrus of 4,000 years ago to its ancient antecedents in the Great Lakes region of Africa 20,000 years prior to that time. And so I always ask our young black students, so what are they afraid of when mathematics is concerned? Why, when it comes time to take mathematics courses, a science that was invented by your remote ancestors, you run the other way. You avoid, you neglect, and yet mathematics was invented in Africa. It doesn't compute, you might say. This is from the temple behind Dendera in Upper Egypt. It's the Temple of Isis. This is a little square aperture that comes, and what you have to imagine is that this square ceiling, this square, bright square patch is actually ceiling, because that's what it is. And so you have to imagine that it's coming down from the ceiling, because that is sunlight coming through the square aperture in the ceiling of the Temple of Isis behind Dendera. Now you see those little humps that are coming towards you on the slide. Those represent those represent the light. That is the diagrammatic or pictorial representation of the light. Notice, therefore, that the ancient people of Kemet designate light coming down to them in waves, because that's what that is, waves. Light moving as waves wasn't discovered until Maxwell and Max Planck about 130 years ago. When Napoleon conquered Egypt in 1798, and we're going to get to medicine and healing. This isn't irrelevant. You might think so, but it isn't, because it's all part of the same continuum. Now, when Napoleon conquered Egypt in 1798, the first thing he brought a whole army, literally, of scientists and engineers and surveyors. And the first thing he instructed them to do was to take a survey of Egypt, and to measure it. Well, they found out their task was made immeasurably easier by the simple expedient of projecting a line due north through the middle of the Great Pyramid, which bisects the delta into two equilateral triangles, and therefore gives them a perfectly easy way of measuring the delta of Lower Egypt. So if they could do it, one has to infer that that wasn't accidental. These things don't happen accidentally. It means that the ancient people 6,000 years previously had already done that for them. The pyramid is a structure composed of 2.3 to 2.7 million blocks of stone. The smallest one weighing 2.5 tons. The largest ones inside the king's chamber weighing up to 100 tons, which were floated down 600 miles from Aswan down the Nile in granite before they were therefore set in place to create the king's chamber. If you were to take those 2.3 to 2.7 million blocks of stone and cut them up into 1-foot squares, you could build a wall 4.5 feet high to go 2/3 away around the globe. The pyramid rises to a height of 481 feet and 8 inches. It is oriented, its faces are oriented perfectly to the 4 cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. Its sides are 755 feet and 6 inches each, with an average area of 1 10,000. As you see there, the descending passage leading to the grotto is oriented perfectly to a star that was in place 3340 BC by the name of Alpha Draconis, or Thuban, that at that time was a pole star and assumes that position once every 26,000 years. Recent evidence has shown that the southern so-called ventilating passages, which there are 2, the lower one is oriented precisely to the star Sirius, and the upper one is oriented precisely to the constellation Orion. So apart from anything else, the pyramid was an almanac and an astronomical observatory. What it wasn't, never was, no one has ever proven it, a tomb for mortal remains. It may have been a tomb in another sense, but not for mortal remains. Other pyramids were, but not the Great Pyramid. Now, a man named Richard Proctor, who was an astronomer from the last century in England, said this about the Great Pyramid, is that it was built up to the 50th concourse, and then the construction stopped. And what is interesting, right at the 50th concourse, the square platform is exactly half of the area of the base. And the base, by the way, is 13 acres in area. And from that point on, they made, at least for a year, maybe longer, they made a series of astronomical observations from that platform. Now, leading us to, this is the so-called Grand Gallery in this corbelled fashion. You see the way it's kind of like that? That's called corbelling. The Grand Gallery debouches or ends or projects right out to the 50th concourse. Now this is what Proctor surmised based on his observations purely as an astronomer. He said, once you look at the opening to the Grand Gallery, the only reason it makes sense for it to be corbelled like that, is if an astronomer had told the architects what he wanted and needed in the construction of that gallery. Because it is possible, not only possible, but likely, virtually to the point of certainty, that what happened is that at nighttime they would station trained star watchers or gazers at various points there along the Grand Gallery, because if the Grand Gallery at that time, before the pyramid was completed, it was oriented perfectly to the southern heavens, and you could very easily watch the movement of certain stars and constellations across that aperture and time it, and therefore do what? Measure the movement of the heavenly vault across the meridian, and therefore establish a heavenly meridian. And if you are measuring the movement of the heavenly vault across the meridian, then what you're really measuring is the movement of the rotation of the earth, the speed of the rotation of the earth. And if you can establish a heavenly meridian, you can establish a earthly meridian, which is longitude. Now you know when Europe was first able to establish longitude accurately? 1767. Now you say, okay, Dr. Finch, this is all speculation. Well, it would be speculation in part if it wasn't for, let's read this caption. To observe the exact moment the sun fills a well without shadow as it reaches its farthest point north at the summer solstice, the observation would have to be made under the northern rim of the sun 15 minutes further north than the line of the Tropic of Cancer in this case. When the Tropic of Cancer was at 23 degrees 51 minutes, the ancient Egyptians observed it at Syene at 24 degrees 6 minutes. Today the Tropic is at 23 degrees 27 minutes. By establishing the moment of the solstice of the Tropic, the ancient astronomers were able to correctly compute the circumference of the earth by the use of deep wells and obelisks. Now, did they? This map absolutely proves that they did. Let's spend some time talking about this map, because this map, maybe more than any other single thing that we have shown so far, is going to establish the breadth and the scope of ancient African science. This is something called the Pires Reyes map, compiled in 1518 or thereabouts by a Turkish admiral by the name of Pires Reyes. What is very interesting about this map is that you can see all the geographical features which are recognizable, I think, to almost anybody. You can see Spain, you can see the Straits of Gibraltar, you can see the west coast of Africa, the east coast of South America, Antarctica, which, by the way, wasn't discovered until 200 years later. Nobody had been there, at least to anybody's knowledge at this time. Pires Reyes had never been there. Columbus had never been there. Not to mention Central America and the Caribbean. All in very close scale relationship to one another, with accurate representation of the geographical features like the coastline, the rivers, islands, etc. Now you have to, and also displaying a very accurate knowledge of longitude and latitude. You have to understand, nobody at that time in 1518 was capable of making a map like this. What did Pires Reyes say concerning the map? He said, I had 20 source maps, including one from Columbus, one. But the other source maps came from where? Came from the time of Alexander, 300 years before Christ. Remember what Alexander did. Before he began his campaign of world conquest, he took Egypt away from the Persians, established himself as Pharaoh, and built his capital of his empire, not in Greece, but in Egypt on African soil. His successors, Ptolemy and the line of pharaohs from Ptolemy, the first two or three, went throughout the length and breadth of Egypt, through all the temples, collecting manuscripts and scrolls of their ancient learning, brought them all back to Alexandria, put them under one house, which became known as the Library of Alexandria, eventually numbering 700,000 copies, making Alexandria the intellectual capital of the world. Then and only then does the so-called Greek scientific miracle begin. Archimedes, Hipparchus, Ptolemy, Galen, Euclid, name somebody, who has a reputation as a great scientist in Greek times, they studied or lived in Alexandria, or both. So the Greek scientific miracle is Northeast African scientific miracles revisited. Now, there's a man by the name of Charles Hapgood, who is the one who analyzed this map with the help of a MIT mathematician and the Strategic Air Command out of Massachusetts. And he said, there is an error in the map. It's a consistent error of 4.5 degrees because the map was based on the computation of the world made by Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes was a Greek who, again, lived in Alexandria and was credited with having measured the world, except for one thing: he made an error. But what Hapgood says, this map reflects that error. But the source maps from which this map came were much more accurate than this map. The point is, he says, even though nobody could make maps like this until the 19th century in Europe, and as good as this map is, it's still, he called it a decline from more ancient map-making standards. Now, where were these map makers that he's talking about, these more ancient map makers? Well, you see those little compass roses around through the Atlantic Ocean. There are 4 of them. You see the big ones, but there are also 2 or 3 smaller ones. They represent the left rim of a perfect circle. Now, this is a so-called Portolano map. The person who was making this map sat more or less at the center of the map. Now, the point is, if you want to know who and where the map maker was, you have to find the center of the circle. Well, where was that? 23.5 degrees north, 30 degrees east. And where is that? 100 miles west of Aswan in Upper Egypt. So, in other words, the original map makers, the maps that they used were even more accurate, and this is the result, because what he did, he got a bunch of maps and compiled them. And this is one of the other reasons for the error. What does this tell you? Well, let's go back to this. The left, you see, you can see it. It's easy to the naked eye to see that the map has been ripped, right? It's like it's been ripped in half. What you're seeing is the left half of the map. If you had the whole map, what would you be seeing? You'd be seeing Southern Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Indian Ocean. Now, what I want you to understand is that the original source maps indicate a complete knowledge of the circumference of the Earth and all of the Earth's geographical features. Now, what does that mean? It means what Van Sertima has always said. People didn't just start crossing the oceans before when Columbus did. You got to understand, 600 BC, there was a pharaoh called Necho who sent a fleet commanded by a Phoenician captain and a mixed Ethiopian, Phoenician, and Egyptian crew around Africa from west to east. Took 3 years, 2,100 years before Vasco da Gama. In 1415, an East African city called Malindi sent a giraffe to the Emperor of China, crossing the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea at a distance twice as far as it took Columbus to make his voyage. How did the original Hawaiians get to Hawaii? They traveled 3,000 miles of open ocean in catamaran canoes. You do not need the Queen Mary to make ocean-going voyages. And the assumption that nobody was doing it before Columbus is just that, an assumption. It has absolutely nothing to do, or Captain Cook, it has absolutely nothing to do with what actually happened. The Greeks themselves, in 5, I count them, 6 different citations talk about a continent west of the Pillars of Hercules, which was the Straits of Gibraltar, that had mountains and rivers. So they said, we got this information from the Phoenicians. You got to understand, there already was in antiquity a worldwide trade and diplomatic network that spanned the entire globe, and one has to assume that when Pharaoh Necho was sending his fleet around Africa, 600 years BC, what was he doing? He was mapping the continent. It's the only thing that makes sense. That and trade. What am I trying to get across here? Your whole perception of what happened in history has got to change. Because the history that is taught to you in the textbook is really the iceberg phenomenon. It's the shadow play. There is a huge underground, submerged, subterranean history, which is most of what really actually happened, that you never see or hear about, because history is not written from a world point of view. It's written from the point of view of whom? It's written from the point of view of conquerors. And who are the conquerors? Europe. The ancient Chinese had this interesting, the ancient Chinese dynasties, emperors had this very interesting practice. Whenever a new dynasty came into power, they would get all the historians in the kingdom and say, okay, rewrite the history of China up to my dynasty and make sure you make my dynasty and my ancestors look good in the process. So you see, other people understand the functions of history and history writing, except us. I have never heard anybody but an African American, a black American, question the need to study their own history. We're the only people who do that. Nobody does that except us. What kind, how's it going to get me a job? Nobody else asks that question except us. It wasn't just in Egypt, so Northeast Africa. These are patterned of stones in Namratunga, northwestern Kenya. Well, Dr. Finch, they're just a bunch of bent stones, so what? The so what is that they're precisely aligned to 6 stars and star groupings, including Bellatrix, Orion, Saiph, Sirius, Aldebaran, and Triangulum. Now, check out Triangulum there in the bottom, the bottom graph. These are the so-called people, they're called the Kushite-speaking people of northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. They have a very interesting calendar. The calendar that they still use it today, in which, at the second half of their calendar, they mark off by the phases of the moon in relationships to the rising and setting of Triangulum in the northern sky. There is no calendar like it anywhere in the world or anywhere in history that I am aware of. It is completely unique to them. And they're still using it. People, we have a very sort of commonplace idea about the calendar. It's something to mark off the days, the weeks, the months, and the seasons. But what you don't realize, whether you're looking at your clock or your desk calendar or whatever, what it is really marking off is the movement of celestial bodies, which, if were to be accurate, means you have to have had very scientifically precise data about these heavenly bodies, sun, moon, stars, planets, not known. You look at these people in another time and place, we would call them half-naked savages. Something very interesting about this half-naked savages and what they're standing in front of. What they're standing in front of is a iron smelter and steel maker, whose technology goes back 2,500 years, made entirely out of either termite mud or anthill mud, because it is impermeable to water. They use a technique that is completely their own. Nobody else discovered it. Nobody. Except in 4 other places in Africa. But no place outside of Africa had ever evolved this technique. No one's found it anywhere. Not among the Romans, the Indians, the Chinese, Arabs, nowhere. Of preheating air by blowing them through those bellows. The preheated air reached a temperature of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the smelting area, eventually created temperatures of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody until 1850 had the capacity to do that, anywhere in the world. What is the difference between iron and steel? The only difference between iron and steel is 1.5% carbon. But it gives a hardness to the iron that's 100 to 1,000 times more. There, in Ghana, their steel-making production, they had produced some local steel in 1967. By a technique that's very much like this one. Someone tried to cut it with a diamond rotary blade. You can cut anything with diamond. Anything. But they couldn't even make a scratch on this steel from Africa. So much so that they said that the local steel was better than anything that was imported, but the imported steel was so abundant and so cheap, much cheaper, that it just overwhelmed the native industry. But the point is, nobody ever excelled these people in their so-called primitive technology, but creating technological effects in steel making that really have yet to be surpassed. Let's talk about these people. The Dogon of southeastern Mali along the Bandiagara cliffs. These are four of the informants. One of them is a woman in the lower left-hand corner. You see that big bright splotch up on top, that's Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the heavens, 8.7 light years away, outside the solar system itself, as seen from Earth. The right lower hand corner is the Sirius B. Why? Because Sirius is a binary star system. Most stars are, by the way. They usually have companions. And Sirius A, the Sirius star system is also a binary star system. And the big white bright one is called Sirius A, and the smaller one that you can barely see is called Sirius B. Now let's talk a little bit about them. Perhaps the most remarkable astronomers in Africa since the time of old Kemet are the Dogon. These people are present-day inhabitants of Mali, but they claim to have originally come from the northeast. They live in Neolithic villages and appear to be pre-literate, and I have been to their villages. I have been to Mali and visited them, but possess such astounding scientific knowledge of the cosmos that many wild theories have been invented to explain it. Though they have lived in their present habitat abutting the Bandiagara cliffs in southeastern Mali for 700 years, their tradition suggests that they began their original migration more than 1,400 years ago, most likely from the Nile Valley. The most remarkable details of their astronomical knowledge involve the binary star system Sirius, around which orbits a companion star, Sirius B. It is on this latter body that the Dogon have concentrated their attention. The Dogon are people who have never so much as seen a telescope and yet know that Sirius B, which they call the star of deep beginnings, is a white dwarf star, and they call it a white seed. It's a white dwarf star that, like all white dwarfs, is incredibly dense and heavy. They describe the dense matter of Sirius B as being of a metallic substance, and this corresponds to present knowledge which tells us that a metal unknown on Earth comprises the substance of Sirius B. They know correctly that its orbit around Sirius A is a 50 years duration, and that the orbit of Sirius A is irregular because of the orbital motion of Sirius B that distorts it. They know that the orbit is elliptical rather than circular, and what is most astonishing, they describe the supernova explosion that transforms a dying star into a white dwarf. The relation between nova and supernova explosions and white dwarfs was not known in modern astronomy until 1913. Dogon astronomy also includes many details about other constellations such as Orion and the Pleiades. The sun itself is correctly described as turning on its own axis and generating its intense energies from its center. The Dogon describe the Milky Way as a spiral galaxy, which it is, and speak of uncountable numbers of other galaxies that fill the far reaches of the universe. These star worlds are said by the Dogon to be moving away from Earth, which Hubble demonstrated in 1922. What defies imagination, however, is their descriptions of the nature and the matter, descriptions of the nature of matter and the structure of the universe. They describe creation occurring as a result of an explosion or bursting of an incredibly small seed, i.e. the Big Bang, and say that matter itself is composed of infinitely small spinning particles, i.e. atoms. Here we have moved into a realm perilously close to the most advanced theoretical physics and quantum mechanics among a people assumed to be pre-literate. This is their description of a supernova explosion. Look at this. This is one of their drawings. This is the primordial egg of Amma, in which are 44 yala. 44 yala are marks of infinite potentiality. Now and they also talk about 44 yala and 4 sex souls. In human beings, there are what we call sex chromosomes and non-sex chromosomes. We have 44 sex chromosomes. And that's where our potentiality comes from. And our ovum and sperm eggs are created by 4s. Now look at that very carefully. Now check this out. We'll do it one more time. Oh, sorry. Can you begin to understand how history might be in itself healing? Matter of fact, maybe you can't have healing without it. As a physician, you know the first thing I'm taught to do when I see a patient? Take a history. Now, if we're trying to diagnose what our collective problem is, collectively, what do we need to do? Take a history. Let us now jump into our subject in the... What is our... How much longer? Okay, sorry. Sunu or Swenwe. This is the hieroglyphic symbol, so-called Medu Neter, if you more appropriately, which means the physician. The god, or the Neter Thoth, the earliest, or one of the earliest gods or Neter of medicine and healing, the prototype of the Greek Hermes. I would ask you to go to a doctor's office or to a hospital or medical school, and what will you find as a symbol of medicine? The staff with a snake twined around it. Note what is in his hand, left hand, the staff with a snake twined around it. Therefore, your own modern symbol of medicine comes down to an unbroken line of descent from 6,000 years ago from Northeast Africa. The man called Imhotep, or Hetep, he who comes in peace. Osler, so William Osler called him the first figure of a physician who stands out clearly from the mists of antiquity. I like to call him the first universal genius of whom we have any knowledge. He lived by long chronology about 3800 BC, 5,800 years ago. He was many things. He was prime minister under Djoser, a philosopher, an architect of genius, having designed and supervised the construction of the so-called step pyramid of Saqqara, an astronomer, but above all, he was a divinely gifted physician. If there is such thing as a father of medicine, it is Imhotep or it is no one. The step pyramid of Saqqara. There are those of us who have been to the Nile Valley and have seen this marvelous structure, the first great edifice in stone ever created by human hands, ever. It is still one of the architectural marvels of the world. If he had done nothing else but this, his place in the annals of human achievement would be assured, but he was even more renowned as a physician. One of the eminent ladies of antiquity, Peseshet, overseer, she was a chief of woman doctors. She goes back about 2000 BC because there was a corps of women physicians in ancient Kemet. And she was the most prominent, and she wasn't just a physician. She became chief of physicians. Someone says, Dr. Finch, someone once said, well, Dr. Finch, if Imhotep is the father of medicine, wouldn't it be appropriate to call Peseshet the mother of medicine? And I says, well, I certainly don't have any argument against that. This is a Per Ankh, House of Life, model on the Temple of Edfu in Upper Egypt. It is the hospital, temple, place where the clinic, it was a place where the priest physicians were trained. Also, every last one of your Greek philosophers and scientists who studied in Egypt, and virtually all of them did, from Pythagoras all the way down to Galen, studied in a Per Ankh. Not only in Alexandria, but also in Memphis, so-called, and Thebes or Waset. This is a Alexandrian diagram of the construction of the heart. It is undoubtedly derived from something called the Book of the Heart and Vessels, which is attested to as 6000 BC, in which is described the heart as the center of the circulatory system. The main vessels that come out of the heart and go into the other parts of the body also are described, or the movement of the blood through the vessels and the phenomena of pulsation that occurs as a result of it. So if you're talking about the beginnings of cardiovascular physiology, again, where do you look? Ancient Kemet. Same thing applies to anatomy, particularly neuroanatomy. This is a modern drawing, but what are indicated are the anatomical landmarks of the interior of the skull, including the meninges, the cerebral cortex, the spinal cord, even the temporal portion of the brain is indicated, and they knew then that this is where is controlled language, speech, and hearing. So, anatomy begins there also. You can begin to see why it is impossible to look anywhere else but Northeast Africa for the beginnings of medicine, as we understand the term. This is from Komombo, also in Upper Egypt. These are surgical instruments, also a wash basin, sponges for cleaning, even balance scales, probably to weigh out medicines. These are skulls from, again, the Old Kingdom, I think. Those holes that you see in the skulls were made artificially while the people who possessed these skulls were still living, called trepanation or craniotomy, used to treat a variety of neuropathological conditions. You see trepanation in many different parts of the world, not just Africa, but you can trace it to ancient Kemet going back 6,000 years ago. Now you know that these people survived the operation because you see the grainy appearance of the hole on the left and a kind of smooth margin of the hole on the right. That indicates healing. You say, okay, Dr. Finch, that was then, this is now, that was primitive and we're sophisticated, we don't do that anymore, and you'd be wrong. Your erstwhile president 6 years ago had exactly, and I do mean exactly, the same operation. These are from about 300 years before Christ, eye surgical instruments. We know as a matter of fact, and we'll come back to this, in Timbuktu and Mali and elsewhere in Africa, cataract surgery was, and by the way still is, performed by traditional surgeons. Conceived